Let's talk about the psychology of faith. So in psychology, they have this thing called the hierarchy of consciousness. Okay, and so what that means is that in your consciousness, right, what you're conscious of, there's a hierarchy, meaning that there are levels to your consciousness. A simple way to think about this would be, right now I'm moving my hand. I am consciously controlling my hand movement. However, I'm also breathing, but that's happening subconsciously. So the control of my breathing is something that's subconscious, whereas the control of my hand is something that's conscious. All right, so with that as a framework, let's lay out the hierarchy. All right, so in the sense of moving from the things you are most conscious of to the things you are least conscious of, you begin with behaviors. So essentially, you are most conscious of the things that you are doing, right? The behaviors that you're performing, that's what you're most conscious of in the hierarchy of consciousness. Now, the second most thing that you're conscious of would be your capabilities. So, for example, if I didn't have legs, I would recognize that, or I'd be conscious of the fact that walking would be out of the question. So you're conscious of your behaviors, and then second most conscious of your capabilities. Now, moving up in the hierarchy, the next thing you're conscious of are your beliefs. So what you believe about the world, about life, that's the thing you're next most conscious of. So most conscious of your behaviors, you're less conscious of your capabilities, and you're even less conscious of the things that you believe. Continuing up the hierarchy, you're then conscious of your identity, the sense of who you are and what you are. And then the final layer of consciousness, depending on which sect of psychology you're in, one group would call it purpose. So you're conscious of this thing that's outside of you that gives you purpose. Or another group would call it the spiritual realm. So you're conscious of this realm that's outside of you that is providing your kind of like value system. It's basically provides your orientation to the universe, for lack of a better word. Okay, so now putting it all together, in our hierarchy of consciousness, we have our behaviors, that's the thing we're the most conscious of, then our capabilities, then our beliefs, then our identity, and then finally either purpose or spirit, depending on which one you ascribe to. All right, so here's where it gets weird. So each layer controls the layer beneath. So what that means is that your behaviors are controlled by your capabilities. So if I am incapable of doing something, that will dictate the behaviors that I could perform, right? However, your beliefs control your capabilities. This is where the whole idea of manifesting comes from. The thing that, like, if you believe it, you can achieve it. All of this comes from that framework, because if you believe you can't do something, you actually can't do it, because the belief controls the capability. Now, that does not work in the other direction, contrary to popular belief. Believing that I am Michael Jordan or I can be Michael Jordan doesn't automatically give me the capabilities of being Michael Jordan. But it can prevent me from ever acquiring those capabilities, because if I believe that I can never get there, the capabilities will never materialize for me to do that. So we have beliefs controlling our capabilities, capabilities controlling our behaviors, and then the one at the very, very bottom, I actually missed one, is environment. So the environment around you, kind of your physical environment, that's actually the thing you're the most conscious of, even before your behaviors. All right, so moving up the hierarchy, now we move into identity. So who you are actually dictates what you believe. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but it's actually true. So identity can be derived from a number of places, and we'll get into that in a minute. But for the sake of kind of understanding how this works, if your parents have given you an identity of being a loser, right? And that happens sometimes. A parent and family all just kind of are like, hey, you suck, you're a loser, you're not worthy, you're incapable, right? All of those things. That is an identity that is then given to a child, and that identity is where all of their beliefs form from. So you form your beliefs based on the identity, not the other way around. So what you believe about yourself actually is based on the identity that you're given. It's not based on, like, that's why you can't just like change your belief and go, well, I don't believe that, I now believe that I'm, something different. You can't address that there. You actually have to address the beliefs about yourself at the identity layer, which is actually a releasing of an identity that's been given to you, and an accepting of a different identity that allows for you to have different beliefs about yourself. And then those beliefs control what you're capable of. The capabilities control your behaviors, and then your behaviors produce the environment that you live in. Okay, but we're not done yet. So now we have to go up even higher, because your identity is actually derived from, depending on what your viewpoint is, I would argue that a naturalistic person will derive their identity from a purpose that's either given to them or a purpose that they've chosen to align themselves with. That's why you often see people who don't believe in God get caught up in causes, because you need something that is greater than yourself to align with, to derive your identity from. And so people who don't believe in the spiritual realm will frequently find themselves aligning with some type of cause. I actually think that's why atheists are so aggressive towards Christianity, is that their identity has to be rooted in the idea that there is no God. And so their purpose becomes the refutation of God, because they need something to support the identity that they have. But that's a topic for another time. So with that, then, we have this purpose or spirit, right? The thing that's outside of ourself in an exterior realm. So it's not a physical thing. It's not something that we're aware of in the natural. That's our environment. It's actually something outside that kind of lives in the realm of the soul, and that's the thing that all people that are kind of in this area of psychology, they agree on, is that we can't really point to exactly what this thing is that we're deriving from, but we just recognize that it's not environmental. It's actually something else altogether. All right, so now if we put all this together, if you derive your identity from purpose, spirit, whatever you want to call that, that identity dictates what you are able to believe. Okay? It's very important to understand this. Your beliefs are controlled by who you are, not the other way around. Those beliefs then control what you're capable of. Those capabilities then control your behaviors, and then your behaviors actually produce the environment, which is why people frequently end up in a feedback loop where they believe something like they believe all men are bad, right? And so that then creates a situation where they're incapable of seeing any men that are good, because they believe that all men are bad. So any good man that comes along, they can't see it. They're incapable of processing it, because it violates a fundamental belief that they have. And so then, as a result of that, their behaviors become treating all men like they're bad, which then produces an environment where they're either surrounded by men who are bad because they're looking for things to validate their belief, or they find men who might have been good men, but because of the way they treat them, they actually end up being bad or treating them poorly, which then becomes the self-eating ice cream cone that most people stay within. And so essentially what you have is you have a feedback loop that works from the top, which I'm going to go with the spirit realm. Let's set purpose aside for right now, and let's just work within the spiritual, since that's more my focus. So let's assume that you have a spiritual realm. That spiritual realm, we are deriving an identity from that spiritual realm. That identity is then dictating what we believe. Those beliefs are then controlling our capabilities. Our capabilities are then dictating our behaviors. And then our behaviors are producing an environment that then feeds all the way back up to the top and validates what we have drawn down from the spirit. So basically your behaviors and your identity are wedged between two realities. One is a spiritual reality and one is a natural reality. And they're producing this kind of back and forth feedback loop. So you derive something from the spirit, you implement it into the natural then feeds back either true or false, which then feeds back up to the top, and it kind of becomes this back and forth thing that we live between. I know this is tough without a visual, but hopefully you guys are tracking with me. So with that framework now, check this out. Without God, your conscious of your standing within the spiritual world, which is condemned. Because without Jesus, we are separated from God. And so we are conscious of our condemnation. And so our identity becomes an identity of a condemned person, which causes us to believe all manner of lies about ourselves, which then controls our capabilities and then produces behaviors that lead to death. Because dead people tend towards things that validate their beliefs about themselves. So because we're dead and condemned in the spirit, we tend to act that out in our behaviors. And it's like our capabilities to control sin in our life and our capabilities to control like our worst behaviors that come out, all of those things are the reason that we don't find any power over those things prior to meeting Jesus, is because of the fact that our identity is one of a condemned person. So we don't have an identity that is capable of overthrowing the sinful behaviors in our life, because those behaviors are being controlled by an identity of a condemned person. However, when we meet Jesus and we are born again, there is a new identity that is born in the Spirit. Okay, so identity is controlled by the Spirit, right? So when we're born again in the Spirit, we receive a new identity. That's why it says we're born again. That new identity is a son. It is a son of God. It is a person who is alive in Christ, no longer condemned. We are no longer under condemnation. Now, what does that identity allow us to do? Well, it allows us to believe some different things about ourselves. Like, it allows us to believe that we are worthy, that we are worthy of love, that we are worthy of good things. It allows us to believe that we have the capability to overcome sin in our life, because Jesus says that through him we do have power over sin, right? So then that leads to change in behaviors, which changes the environment that we live in. Now you can get into some crazy stuff about how we not only change the physical environment, we actually change the spiritual environment when we get this thing lined up. But that's a whole topic for another time. The main point of this is this: if you are struggling with sin in your life and you are finding that you cannot find victory over that sin, stop trying to attack it at the behavioral level, because you cannot control flesh with flesh. And you can't attack it at the belief level either, because you can't change your beliefs if your identity is not lined up. All sin stems from a misunderstanding of who we are in Christ. That's the foundation. That's the beginning. That's the part that we have to get a hold of. When you understand who you are in Christ, everything changes. That's why it says that if somebody fears, it is because they have not yet been perfected in love, because perfect love casts out all fear. And what is perfect love? Perfect love, okay, or actually let me reframe that. The identity of being loved casts out fear in the soul, the belief that you need to be afraid, the belief that you are in danger goes away when you understand your identity in Christ. A person whose identity is one that is loved means that they no longer believe that they need to fight for themselves. They need to provide for themselves. They need to address all of the matters of life. You no longer believe that, because your identity is someone who is loved, not someone who is condemned. Whereas a person whose identity is one that is condemned, then they will believe that they need to justify themselves, that they need to fight for themselves, that they need to provide for themselves, and that they need to cope with the fact that they are condemned. That's why so many people find themselves caught up in cycles of sin, because they're not coping with the environment and the circumstances of their life. They're coping with the fact that in their soul, they have an identity of a condemned person, and they are coping with the fact that they have condemnation as their future. That's why a person whose identity is one that is loved can be in the worst situation imaginable, and they will still have joy, because their identity is one that is loved, and they don't need to cope with the identity of being condemned. I know that was a lot of information and probably somewhat complicated the way I just presented that. So I'll probably do a more robust breakdown on this at some point. But God, I hope that helps some of you guys, because if you can get your mind around this, it changes everything.